Kicking off the list at number 10, Souvenir Symbiote. So during the events of 1984's Secret Wars, Spidey came across a symbiote while on Battleworld. In issue 7, Spider-Woman makes her grand entrance, and Peter Parker reacts in his usual manner. I mean, one of his first thoughts is to sue her for infringing on his shtick, but he clocks that she just tossed a boulder as easily as he could, so maybe there's more behind her than meets the eye. In the next issue, he gets an up-close personal look at this new black suit Spider-Woman was rocking, and now we have a new costume for Spidey, and he loves it. He feels stronger, he feels quicker, and he's even impressed by the mechanics of the suit's ability to change. So while it all seemed like the perfect aid in this massive battle, Peter questioned why his new suit was so different after all. Oh well, he says, and then he returns to Earth with his new suit that just happens to activate his Spidey sense. And we all know that there was much more to this suit than we thought. You gotta leave things where you find them, Pete. You never know, they might just be, I don't know, an alien race. And before we go on to number 9, if you guys could go ahead and give us a like on this video because it helps the channel out a lot over here. You guys are the best. Thank you so much. Now back to some more Spider-Man mistakes. Number 9, I am Spider-Man? Yeah, super identities are meant to be super secret, okay? So when Tony Stark announced that he was Iron Man on the big screen, I mean, sure, it was a cool moment, but since then, there have been numerous people trying to take him down. During the events of Civil War issue 2, Spider-Man decides to take a page out of Tony's book and announces to the world who the webslinger really was. So later on, we see a bullet that was aiming for MJ, but ended up hitting Aunt May instead, resulting in one of the best Spider-Man arcs ever, the Back in Black storyline. So while it's cool to see Peter rage out and get payback wearing nothing but a polo and cool pants, all that pain could have been avoided if you just kept your mask on and your mouth shut. Number 8, the deal with the devil. Next up on our list, we have One More Day. The story began in 2007 in Amazing Spider-Man issue 544. We see Spider-Man make a deal with the devil, Mephisto. So after Spider-Man revealed his identity in the Civil War storyline, that bullet hit Aunt May, which I just talked about, but that's not the end of it. Yeah, the devil shows up and offers a deal to Peter while Aunt May is currently dying from said bullet. So MJ adds to this massive pitch. So basically what ends up happening is that the world will forget about Peter's identity. Aunt May will live, but in order for that to happen, MJ and Peter never got married. Kind of like in Shrek 4, for all the 9 people that watch Shrek 4. So they hug one final time and MJ explains that their love was always meant to be and that whatever Mephisto does is unstoppable. And then poof, the deal is sealed. The next day, Peter's like, oh man, another uneventful night, just the way I like it. And that fast, all that backstory was just wiped out at the turn of one page. And readers at this point were also forced to suffer and join alongside this horrible end to this horrible deal. Number 7, homesick. So now is a time more than ever when we have to be careful about spreading any virus, right? So you would think when Peter gets bitten during, say, I don't know, a zombie apocalypse, he would stay as far away from his loved ones as possible. In Marvel's Zombies Army of Darkness, we see our heroes run into Ash Williams, traveler between worlds. And he's arrived with the Necronomicon, warning him that the army of the dead will rise in this world. So Peter sees this firsthand beside Ash, and he decides he's not going to let any more innocents die on his watch. And then in the next issue, after being bit himself, Peter pretends to munch on Hawkeye's brains before making a daring escape. Not a bad idea. So he gets Ash to safety, explaining why he's still a human being. And then Spidey decided to go home and make sure that May and MJ were okay with this bite and first-hand experience as to what happens. And Peter's newfound appetite starts to kick in. You should have stayed away, Peter. This went from bad to worse real quick. Number 6, not worth the fight. So we have Peter Parker, but this time from Earth 982, aka the MC2 universe, which is my personal favorite. Wonder why. So after a battle with the Green Goblin, Peter ends up losing his entire left leg. And at the start of this issue, he reflects on how much he loved his newborn daughter, saying he wanted to spend every waking moment with her and MJ. But he had other responsibilities. At least he thought he did. His words, not mine. So when May was 2 years old, he got into a fight with the Green Goblin and ended up losing a leg because of it, ending his days as the web-slinger. Now it's great in one way because we get to see May Parker rise to the occasion and put on the suit herself, and she's totally badass while she does it. But to think how differently their lives would have been had Peter have just retired and, I don't know, focused on his family, it would have been a lot different. So while Peter is walking around with a fake leg and cane, she's swinging around busting arms dealers. Let's just hope she comes across a, I don't know, leg dealer. Number 5, too much fun. I mean, sure, saving people can be a blast, swinging through the air, doing flips, talking the entire time to bad guys, but when you find yourself totally comfortable in any job, that's when mistakes happen, when you're not paying full attention. And we see this unfold in a brutal way in Spider-Man issue 17, titled At the Hands of Thanos. So he's going over the mental checklist of things to do in his Spider-Man day, like pick up Mary Jane, and no, not that kind. Fill up on web fluid, usual Spidey stuff. When suddenly a couple workers fall off the side of a building, Peter even acknowledges that this is just another walk in the park for him. He saves them, but the cooling machine falls and then explodes, sending Spider-Man hurling in the air, killing Peter Parker. Now, believe me, that sounds terrible and all, but it gets worse. Yeah. Death isn't the end, and especially in the world where Thanos is around. He meets Peter in the afterlife and makes him watch as a mother yells in agony over the loss of her child during that same explosion. So not only did Spider-Man get himself killed trying to save the woman and her daughter, but he didn't even save the kid. I mean, maybe if you weren't so focused on the barbecue sauce, things would have turned out differently. I don't know. I'm just saying, I don't know. Number 4, a helping hand. It's always fun giving one of your favorite teachers help during a project. I mean, giving them a hand though, literally, could end up pretty bad. So in the comics, Dr. Kurt Connors lost his arm due to an explosion during a war and started to spend his life researching on new ways to grow it back. So once this finally happened, there were a few side effects. And as we see in the Amazing Spider-Man movie, Dr. Curtis Connors becomes a lizard man. And no, not like a lizard man. He becomes a lizard man. Like he's a giant lizard. Sorry, what happened? I mean, sure, lizards can grow back their tails easily, but when you add that in with a human driven by rage, the brain can alter as well. So his story arc begins with the Amazing Spider-Man 6, if you want to see that nightmare take place. Number 3, silence is golden. How many girls does Spider-Man have in these comics? Well, that's a tricky question, because Spider-Man and Peter Parker are different people. They're perceived differently by others, specifically Black Cat. Black Cat, being a known burglar, is met by Spider-Man in the night, and she knows he's attracted to her, and she digs the webhead as well. I mean, look at him, who doesn't? All that confidence, all that lankiness, you gotta. In Amazing Spider-Man issue 194, we see the two of them get pretty flirty and even exchange a kiss. But when Black Cat finds out who Spider-Man really is, she's actually less interested. Come on, Pete, you gotta play it cool. Be that mysterious guy. Number 2, the spider or the man. We now go to Amazing Spider-Man issue 100 back in 1963. The issue begins with Peter Parker wanting to dismiss his abilities. I mean, I'll take them off your hands gladly if you wanna just, toss those to the side, sure. So he thinks it's a great idea to drink the solution that he's had that would get rid of his superpowers. Just in case he wanted to, I don't know, get rid of superpowers for some reason. For Gwen, he says, before downing the mix. And as you could have guessed, it doesn't work at all. Well, kind of. I mean, he grows 4 extra arms, so, take that what you will. Not like this, he says. Oh yeah, homemade vaccine for the win. And finally, number 1, not my problem. In a list full of mistakes, I think it's only fair to end on the mistake that haunts Peter the most. After letting a thug out of his sights, that thug ended up being the one to take his Uncle Ben's life. So not only did Peter, of course, feel saddened by this tremendous loss, especially not having parents in the first place, but he was responsible for letting this thug get away, and he honestly just let it happen. And it all takes place in Amazing Fantasy issue 15. Oh yeah, we see this mess go down right here. So after a police officer asks Spider-Man why he let the crook get in an elevator and make a break for it, Spider-Man responds in a sassy way with, "Sorry pal, that's your job. I'm through being pushed around by anyone. From now on, I just look out for number 1. That means me." Sounds like a great plan, Pete. So how did that end up again?
Coming in at number 10, we have Spider-Wolf. Now, not a whole lot is known about this version of Spider-Man or his origin other than that he hails from Earth 13,989, a universe that is a little bit more gothic and assumed to be home to a number of werewolves. Now, the Spider-Man of this universe is no exception, but you probably already guessed that based off of his appearance alone. Going by the name Spider-Wolf, he has all the normal powers you would normally associate with Spider-Man, combined with the strength and the speed of a werewolf, which, as one can imagine, would make him incredibly powerful and a little bit scary to be around. Realizing this, the villain Karn sought out to defeat Spider-Wolf before he was recruited by the heroes of the Spider-Verse, as he could have been one of the Spider Army's most powerful allies. Karn is successful in taking him out for good before moving on to the other Spider-Folk in hopes of outsmarting the Spider Army. Created by Dan Slott, this is unfortunately all we know about this version of Spider-Man. Maybe we'll see him again in the future, who knows, but why not check him out for yourself in their first and last appearance in 2015's Amazing Spider-Man Volume 3, number 11. Number 9, we have Man-Spider. Now, there have been multiple iterations of Man-Spider throughout the years, such as the one that appeared in 1982's Marvel Fanfare number 1, when Spider-Man was exposed to a machine that turned people into primitive monsters, making him the Man-Spider, or in 1971's The Amazing Spider-Man number 100, when Peter tried to cure himself of his powers, but instead mutated them further, giving him 6 arms. I want to focus on Peter Parker, who is Earth 6078, because although his story isn't dark full of murder, it is dark as in he loses what makes him the lovable hero. Now in this iteration, Peter gains his powers in a similar manner to ours, but Aunt May dies in an accident instead of Uncle Ben. This, for some reason, leads Peter to reveal his powers to his uncle, asking him to be his showbiz manager. And needless to say, like many talented folk, Peter ended up getting a very big head and started neglecting his duties as a hero, showing off his powers for fame and profit instead, while other heroes took care of the villains. Now this caused some serious strain on his relationship with Uncle Ben, and it eventually got to the point where they stopped talking, and Peter just sends him money now out of habit to feel less guilt. Check out the sad excuse of a Spider-Man in his first appearance in 2006's Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man number 8. Number 8, the Imperfect Spider-Man. Coming to us from the critical flop Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects, we have Earth 50,701's Peter Parker, and from what we see, he is basically Earth 616 Peter Parker with a bit of a darker twist. Now if you're not familiar with the plot of this video game from 2005, that is absolutely okay. You did not miss very much, and it was not a good game at all. In the story mode, we see Spider-Man, the Thing, Wolverine, and Elektra captured and injected with a drug developed by an alien scientist that corrupted them and turned them into bloodthirsty killers. The now brutally violent and eager to fight heroes face off against each other in a Coliseum type battle. Thankfully, it didn't last long before Spider-Man was able to fight the drug and escape, leading the fight against a group called the Imperfects that had been infected with the same drug. Now, obviously they come out on top because it would make for a pretty terrible story if they didn't. Although this game was a massive flop, it did spin off into a very interesting series called Marvel Nemesis The Imperfects, and within 6 issues they did a better job of explaining exactly what happened in that universe. So if you're curious, check out this limited run for yourself, or honestly, if you're a fan of bad video games and you still have a GameCube lying around, maybe try and find the game. Number 7, Spider-Cyborg. On the apocalyptic Earth 2818, operating in the year 2099 AD, we have a slightly darker version of Peter Parker, who alongside his spider abilities, gains some cybernetic enhancements as well. Equipped with cybernetics covering most of his body, giving him stronger legs, metallic claws, enhanced vision, and even a sonic cannon for an arm, this Spider-Man does not come to play. Essentially, Spider-Cyborg was the perfect combination of Marvel Spider-Man and DC Cyborg, making him into one of the most powerful heroes in the Spider-Verse. Now, unfortunately, like many of the other strong alternate Spider-Men, Spider-Cyborg was immediately targeted by the villain Karn due to the threat that he posed. However, the superior Spider-Man appeared just in the nick of time and defeated the villain. Joining forces with the superior Spider Army, Spider-Cyborg attempts to defeat Karn alongside the other Spider heroes, but is eventually destroyed by Deimos when the Inheritors invaded their home base on Earth 928. Now that's all we know about this Peter Parker, which is kind of disappointing because he definitely has a badass backstory, otherwise he wouldn't have so many cybernetic enhancements. If you know anything more about this character, well, let me know in the comments below, but in the meantime, why not check out his first appearance in 2014 Superior Spider-Man number 33. Number 6, Spider-Side. Believing himself to be the real Peter Parker, this Spidey clone was specifically engineered by the Jackal to kill the real Peter Parker, Ben, Kane, and Mary Jane. As a clone, he possesses many of the same abilities the real Peter has, such as superhuman strength, speed, and wall crawling, and spider senses, but what really sets him apart is his complete control over his molecular structure. With this ability, Spider-Side is able to extend his limbs, shapeshift, control the density of his body, and so much more. He actually uses this to simulate the artificial webbing used by Spider-Man by turning parts of himself into semi-liquid and just flicking it around. Adopting the name Spider-Side after the Jackal jokingly said that this Peter would commit mass Spider-Side for him, he actually followed through and once released a toxin in the air that killed 2,600 people across the state of Pennsylvania. Later, Geyer removes his clone degeneration factor after he betrays the Jackal, and good thing he does because that kept him alive for a little bit longer until he eventually fell off the roof of the Daily Bugle and was put in a stasis chamber, preventing him from ever being a threat again. First appearing all the way back in 1995 as Spider-Side in New Warriors number 61, check out this clone's short run as part of the Spider family for yourself. Number 5, Peter Parker, Earth 70,237. Many years into the future, we get a glimpse into the life of a retired Spider-Man who now spends his days working in a flower shop. MJ has already passed away due to radioactivity from what I guess I'll refer to as Peter's lovin'. You probably all know what I'm talking about, and there are actually no more heroes or villains around as a new merciless police force known as the Rain control the city. J. Jonah Jameson of all people is actually the one to convince Peter to take up the mantle of Spider-Man once again to free the city from the Rain. However, this is proven to be a very difficult task, as Mayor Waters does whatever he can to stand in his way. Facing off against the elderly Sinister Six, Peter learns to conquer his demons and truly begins his triumphant return as the friendly webhead. As he is a bit older than most Spider-Men, his reflexes are a little bit rusty and he is more vulnerable to attacks despite having his superhuman durability. After an all-out battle with Rain and Venom, who turned out to be Mayor Waters' assistant, Peter comes out victorious and the world goes back to the way it should be, full of heroes and villains. This version of Peter doesn't get to enjoy the return of heroes for long, as he is murdered by Deimos, having his head crushed by Mary Jane's tombstone. If you're interested, check out this alternate Spider-Man in 2007's Spider-Man Reign #1. Number 4, Webslinger. Originating from Earth, spelled E-U-R-T-H, there was once a young boy who was fascinated by spiders, and as a young man, he dared the journey into the mysterious Web Wood, a place filled with mysterious beings, to meet the mysterious Widow of the Web, because he really just wanted to know more about spiders. Impressed by him, she used her magical abilities to give him all the powers of the Spider Kingdom with one condition attached. He could never use the powers for his own interest. Now, these powers weren't really too much to write home about, considering spiders don't have too much going on for them. He really just gained extra limbs and web generating abilities. Not long after, his uncle was in trouble and the boy ended up using his powers to save him, which really angered the widow, causing her to curse the boy. From that day forward, he lived out his life as a monstrous looking spider-human hybrid. Deciding to isolate himself from society, the boy took up the name Webslinger and became the guardian of Webwood. However, despite all the good he does as Webslinger, he is still seen as no better than the criminals he fights due to his monstrous appearance. Give his story a read for yourself in 2000's Avatar Covenant of the Shield #2. Number 3, we have Spider-Man Noir. Raised by his Aunt May and Uncle Ben during the Great Depression, this Peter was raised to believe that good could triumph over evil no matter what. Now, gaining his powers after an antique spider statue breaks open and he is bit by a horde of spiders, he awakens the next day with these arachnid-like abilities, such as being able to shoot organic webs from his wrists, spider senses, and of course the signature superhuman abilities of every Spider-Man. Equipped with his signature Spider-Man Noir suit modeled after his uncle's World War I airman uniform, Peter stealthily moves about in the shadows, taking down baddies with his spider powers and revolvers. This Peter is pretty interesting because in the beginning of his career, he seemed to have no problem killing villains, killing the Vulture before he could murder his Aunt May. But later on, he seemed to grow conscious and instead relied more on his powers than on his firepower. As a member of the Superior Spider Army, we saw him stationed on Earth 928, and he was a fairly key member of the war until he was very badly injured by Bricks and Bora, and had to kinda sit the rest of it out and do whatever he could from behind the scenes. Outside of that storyline, we have seen him fight the likes of his Earth's Norman Osborn and the Chameleon, and we even got to see him in the animated movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, where he was voiced by Nicolas Cage. Now, if you're wondering why I included him on this list today, since he doesn't really have a dark attitude to the world, here's why. My reasoning is because he literally grew up during the Great Depression, one of the darkest times in human history, and had to deal with some pretty dark subject matter while fighting the urge to succumb to it. So, I highly recommend you check out Spider-Man Noir for yourself in his first appearance in 2009's Spider-Man Noir #1. Coming in at number 2, we have Last Stand Spider-Man. Now, this version of Spider-Man is a possible future Peter Parker that we get to see thanks to Madam Web. In this future, Peter kills Kraven the Hunter to avenge the deaths of Kane and Maddie Franklin, and this sort of flips some switch in Peter because from that point on, he was much darker and deadlier. Adopting a new costume and title as an anti-hero, this version of Spider-Man is kicked out of the Avengers for good and winds up hurting his loved ones so badly, leaving him all alone with no one to worry about. All of his quote-unquote heroic deeds do eventually catch the attention of the police, and he goes on the run as a fugitive. Years later, as an old man, Peter visited his Aunt May's grave, aware that his younger self was actually hiding in the shadows watching his every move. Peter was confronted by the NYPD, and though he was given the choice to surrender and admit to his crimes, he refused and fought against them until he was shot down and killed. Now, I know we've talked about darker versions of Peter that are okay with killing and whatnot, but what sets Last Stand apart is that he seems to eventually realize what he was doing was probably not the best, and he felt the only way to atone for his sins was to actually die. Now, I highly recommend you check the story out for yourself because it is a great read, so head on over to 2003's Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, number 58. And finally, number 1, we have Peter Parker Earth 8351. Known as Assassin Spider-Man, this universe's Peter Parker becomes an assassin working alongside Wolverine. Leaving basically all aspects of his old life behind, including his longtime girlfriend Mary Jane, this Spider-Man is the complete inverse of his 616 counterpart. We later find out during the events of Edge of the Spider-Verse that Peter left his old life behind to protect his loved ones, as he states that with great power comes great responsibility and even greater enemies. Shown to be always serious, lacking his signature quips and jokey demeanor in battle, likely because he has no problem coping with the situation like his mainstream counterpart, this Spidey has shown no qualms about killing and does whatever it takes to get the job done. Now, this is likely due to his friendship with Wolverine, having adapted to his personality to better fit their job style. Having received formal training to hone his skills, this Peter possesses highly refined versions of the Spidey powers we all know and love. The most impressive being his spider senses, which is honed so much that he just seems to know things, even to the point that he knows what's going on before his opponent could think about it. So beating him is nearly impossible to do thanks to this precognition. He's also a master at hand-to-hand combat, able to defeat Black Widow with ease, and a master marksman, able to use any gun he gets his hands on. Added as a member of the Superior Spider-Man's Superior Spider Army, he alongside the other Spider-Men of the multiverse take on Karn. However, he is unfortunately defeated by the likes of Deimos' clone. Appearing for the first time in 2008's What If Spider-Man vs. Wolverine #1, why not check this cold webhead out for yourself?
Kicking off the list at number 10, put on a show. Okay, Peter's life is pretty balanced. I mean, he takes selfies for the Daily Bugle, gets a little bit of cash, gets thrown off a building, has to fight a giant lizard, you name it. With Peter's life, his superhero and work go hand in hand. So in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 4, released back in 1963, we see Peter and he had just finished laying out Sandman. But he forgot to snag a couple of photos of the action. He didn't take any selfies, which is the worst. It's like when you blow candles out on your cake and then your mom's like, nope, you blinked, light them up again. Gotta keep trying this, it's for the scrapbook, let's go. Then you're like, I'm tired. So Peter grabs sand, like just sand off the ground, tosses it up in the air, and then punches through the sand. He's like, yeah, people are gonna buy this, it's the Sandman. And then people do buy it. What a liar. He comes back in all cool, out of breath, like, good people, you can breathe easy. Meanwhile, his Instagram is just popping off with likes. God, what a liar. I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do. You gotta get clout. You gotta get that super clout. And before we list off some more of Peter's dark days, if you guys could go ahead and toss us a thumbs up, because it really helps us out here at the studio. If we get enough likes, they won't kill me. Number 9, giving away Edith. Following the events of Avengers Endgame, aka the Snappening, we see Peter Parker trying to move on in a very new world, while mourning the loss of a co-worker and father figure that is Tony Stark. He wants to just live a normal life. He wants to go away on a trip with his friends and not have any moons hucked at him from any titans. So after trying to ghost Nick Fury in the process, he's handed down Edith, Tony's sweet AI glasses. After a mix-up that almost had his classmate executed by one of Tony's drones, he decides that the handsome, caped, random Jake Gyllenhaal that just came out of nowhere as Mysterio is a safe bet for the tech. I mean, he looks great in the glasses, but like, it's Jake Gyllenhaal. He's gonna look great in anything. But come on, Peter, you think after toying with Stark's suit years before that maybe it's a little bit too much responsibility? I'll get into that later. Number 8, the Betty Brant affair.
Hey, Betty.
So Betty is a staff member at the Daily Bugle. She's been played by Elizabeth Banks in the Tobey Maguire trilogy, and Angourie Rice plays a younger version of her in the new MCU Tom Holland version. Believe it or not though, Betty was actually the first woman that Peter was attracted to when he first started selling photos to the Daily Bugle. So they dated for a bit, but ultimately it didn't work out. No biggie, it happens. Cut to years down the road, Peter's marriage proposal didn't work out too well. She said no, and Betty's marriage to Ned at this point was also not working out. She was having a bit of a rough patch. So she went to Peter for some comfort, and then the obvious happened. She's still married, Pete. Don't do it.
The shots are so good.
I'd love to shoot you sometime.
Peter Parker. Peter.
Number 7, more secrets. Marriage is a big deal, as we kind of just mentioned. I mean, maybe in comic books they happen way more often than they should. So many characters get divorced every other day, I swear. Like, divorce lawyers must make millions of dollars in the comics. Holy shit. But the whole point of a proper marriage is to have everything out there on the table, right? You have to know everything about your significant other. No secrets. I mean, sure, if you're Spider-Man, you have to keep some things to yourself, like the fact that you're Spider-Man. Because maybe your friends will go and say something and then the Green Goblin will hear and then he'll blow up your house or something, or toss your aunt out of a window. I get it. But MJ already knew about Peter Parker being Spider-Man. Of course she did. So right after he had resumed taking on the mantle of the webhead again, he failed to fill in MJ. Yeah, he told her he'd quit and then he didn't tell her that he was, not quitting anymore. Like, dude, she already knew before. Stop making up lies. What are you, Walter White? It's very obvious you're up to something. Everybody's onto it. Number 6, blackmail for a date. So that One More Day storyline that has been mentioned before on our channel that I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this list is a pretty pivotal moment in Spider-Man comics. So after this deal had taken place, Spider-Man was now single and ready to mingle. So in Miss Marvel issue 34, we see a new Peter bump into Miss Marvel. And she's in the middle of this sketchy and totally unplanned mission, as Peter puts it, with the CIA. And she can't use her powers, and she's currently on the run from Norman Osborn, who turned S.H.I.E.L.D. into Hammer at this point. It's wild. So bumping into Peter was pretty ideal at this point. He webbed her to safety, all the while they bickered at each other trying to figure out what's going on, what they're up to, what their real intentions are. And then Carol thanks him with a super knee, bam, right between the legs, and then explains to Peter that she needs his help, which is a good order. That's how you do things in that order. I need help. Can you drive me to the airport? If I do this, says Pete, then I want a date with you, which we see come to fruition 13 issues later. So when Carol responded surprised, he even acknowledged that he didn't realize he was gonna say that until it came out. Cool, maybe it just slipped out. But then once she leaves and agrees to it, he's like, yo, I think I just got a date, score. Come on, Pete. A lot of come on Pete's in this, eh? A lot of just what are you doing, dude? Number 5, truce? Question mark? So at some point it's fair to make a truce, okay? Maybe the conflicts just don't have realistic expectations, and then both parties are like, you know what, this has gone on way too long, let's just call it, no hard feelings. Bam. Like Spider-Man 3, when Pete and Harry teamed up to save the day against Venom and Sandman. That was a great moment. Moviegoers were thrilled to see the end of Bad Boy James Franco and Bad Boy Tobey Maguire. Like, just stop dancing and snapping at people, just fight, I don't know. But in the comics, he made a pretty questionable truce with Venom. And it all happens in the Amazing Spider-Man 375. Spider-Man's parents get kidnapped by Venom. So he's like, no problem, I'll just roll up with your ex-wife. What's up, let's make a deal, what do you got? So Spider-Man saved her life, so in return, a truce was to be made. I mean, sure, this was the kickoff to Venom becoming an anti-hero, and then he can have his own run, but also, it's Venom, you know?
Christineth, are you stupid or are you deaf?
Number 4, the fairy incident. Spider-Man Homecoming. Okay, so after intimidating Aaron Davis with his cool, deep voice, Spider-Man figured out the next move for the arms dealers. So Pete decides to take matters into his own hands and prove that he's worthy of being a suitable Avenger. See, this was right after Tony recruited him to help take down Team Cap in Civil War. So he was warm, he got a taste of the action, and now he wants to do more. That's fair, that's why we love Spider-Man. So the Staten Island Ferry was the next location for the Vulture's arms deal to go down. Let's do it, we got the intel, we're rolling in. So he says some quips, webs a few bad guys up, but the Vulture's Chitauri weapon was just too much for Peter to handle, resulting in the ferry to split in half. Right down the middle too, not even like Titanic. So in a last attempt to keep the civilians safe, he tries to hold on to both sides, which is a sick moment. It's kind of like a homage to other Spider-Man moments. It's great, but people are in danger. People are about to drown. There's like cars that are sinking. It's bad. And thankfully, with Iron Man's surprise arrival, the passengers were saved. Tony was pissed though. He had this whole setup, there was an inside operation, and then Spidey came in and blew it. And he didn't even tell Tony about what he was doing to make matters all the worse, which resulted in Tony taking back the Spider-Man suit. It's always the worst part, right after a breakup. You're like, fine, here's your nice sweater. God, I'm so cold now. Number 3, evil assassin Spider-Man. We go now to Earth 8351, where Spider-Man and Wolverine are training together in Alaska. Nice and cold. So they're trying to go rogue, so they're working on becoming stronger, and they're training, they're having a good time. Now, this Peter Parker, he's a bit more rough around the edges. Even his famous catchphrase is now slightly different. See, in this universe, it is, with great power comes great responsibility and greater enemies, which I like more. It's honest. It's definitely better. Doesn't roll off the tongue, but it's a step in the right direction. And it makes sense why he's going rogue. He's truly trying to protect his friends and family, and saying those few extra words at the end just reaffirms his only goal. So when they're attacked, Spider-Man tells Wolverine just to keep hitting people while he deals with a bad guy wielding not one, but 2 swords. So Spider-Man tries webbing him up, and the swords don't allow that. And Spider-Man even gets laughed at for attempting to do this. And Spider-Man says, you're right, that's not gonna work. Bam, shoots him in the face. Huh? They held off long enough until S.H.I.E.L.D. arrived. Look, I mean, sure, this Spider-Man is a different version, but it's still Spider-Man, right? Like, regardless of the title on the front page, this is a moment most fans remembered long after the pages were closed. He like did a cool peace sign too, and then the bullets popped out his wrist. It was cool. He's like, hey, smell this, bam. Smell this, why the fuck would he say that? Number 2, hit Mary Jane. Spectacular Spider-Man issue 226, we see Ben Reilly and Peter Parker, and the tension is high. They're trying to prove who the real Spider-Man is. It's during all the clone stuff. And they reach a conclusion that Ben Reilly is in fact the real Spider-Man. He is the real father. He is the father. Peter doesn't respond to this well at all. He's upset, obviously. He's watching his entire life basically get stolen in front of him. And then MJ tries to get in the middle, and cool everything down, and Peter instinctively just brushes her off, yelling to leave him alone. Now, you can't really brush somebody off of you when you can lift, I don't know, a bus. He's strong, he's really strong. So him just doing that in a matter of rage, she went flying. And to make matters somehow worse, she was pregnant. Yeah, she was pregnant. And he quickly knew he had messed up, saying, oh God, what have I done? What kind of man am I? I'll tell you what kind of man you are, Spider-Man. You're a guy who gets on a lot of lists of people getting in trouble. That's what you are. Kidding, you're a gem. Stop hitting people. And finally, number 1. The deal with the devil. I mentioned this earlier, now it's time to get into it. Look, sometimes Peter will try and do the right thing. Well, most of the time he'll do the right thing. But then life just gets even harder for him after that. And then he's presented with a new issue to face, and it's like an over and over again thing. It's just a nightmare. And then in 2007, starting with the Amazing Spider-Man issue 544, the storyline One More Day, it's exactly what might happen if you revealed your identity to the public. Following in the footsteps of Tony Stark in the Civil War II storyline, where Peter revealed his true identity in order to support the Superhero Registration Act. So giving out your last name to supervillains, cool, great idea, awesome, nothing bad's gonna happen at all. This of course resulted in Aunt May getting shot, and in order to save her life, he must make a deal with the devil, literally Mephisto. And in doing so, the world will also forget about Peter's true identity. Not a bad deal. The only catch is that Mephisto takes away the marriage of Peter and Mary Jane. And I don't mean a quickie divorce and he's like, hey, sign here, poof. No, I mean it never happened. Their relationship is gone, and at the turn of a page, the marriage was just no more. All those memories, all those moments, gone just like that.
And a 10-8 Aunt May and Mary Jane. Okay, so technically this is Spider-Man, but it's a zombie version of Spider-Man, but I'm gonna count it anyway because this is pretty damn messed up, zombie or not. On Earth 2149, an alien plague ends up infecting all superpowered individuals and turns them into zombies. However, it's later revealed that the Necronomicon from Evil Dead was actually what caused it. But after learning that the plague was actually like a bad thing, Peter ran home to get Aunt May and MJ the hell out of Dodge. But when he gets there, we get a good old case of protagonist syndrome and boom! Zombie Spider. He ends up becoming a zombie and eats the 2 most important people in his life. He also had a fractured jaw before becoming a zombie, so I'm sure you can imagine that this isn't a pretty sight, even by zombie standards. It may not be our Pete, but it was a version of Spider-Man, so it's fine. And at 9, Anna Marconi. Speaking of a version of Spider-Man, let's discuss the Superior Spider-Man and his fascination with Anna Marconi. Superior Spider-Man is actually Otto Octavius, who prior to the Superior Spider-Man storyline had brain swapped with Peter, yet a piece of Peter still remained in his own body, which convinced Otto to end up becoming a hero, albeit a darker one. Doc Ock was up to some really shady stuff while pretending to be Peter, cause since Peter is young, handsome, in shape, and has actual women in his life, Otto tried his luck at getting MJ to sleep with him, but failed miserably. So, things weren't going that well. But then there's Anna Marconi, whom this Otto-Peter hybrid started dating. She had no idea what the real situation was going on inside that noggin, and while it's unclear if they ever actually hopped on the good foot and did the bad thing, it's obvious that things were at least heading in that direction. Otto was in love with her, which was a surprise since he even decided to give Peter back his body to save her, but it was still an absolutely horrific story, immoral, in the highest class of the word. It's creepy as hell and it makes me rethink all relationships. And at 8, interfered with surgery. In the same series as the Anna Marconi situation, the small bit of Peter that was left in his body was trying to regain control, for obvious reasons, because a super villain was piloting his bone mech with meat armor. This small bit of Peter though was at times able to interfere or even control Otto temporarily. One of these moments came in Superior Spider-Man number 8, where there was a device that was capable of wiping Pete from Otto's brain, but to get it he had to perform surgery on a little girl. However, Peter didn't think that Otto could do it, so he tries to stop Otto from even performing the surgery, while he has his Spider-Man mask on, may I add, and an additional face mask, so if evil Spider-Man can do it, so can you. Even still, trying to prevent the surgery to save a little girl's life is a pretty low moment for the Barnacle, even if it was filled with good intentions. Kind of. Those only power crystals, Actually, is that how it works? I don't know. I don't think like Topaz is good to cure my depression or something. And in 7, scarring Harry Osborn. While Spider-Man 3 in and of itself is one of the most despicable things that Spider-Man has done, well, with the exception of that sweet dance scene, One of the most horrible things actually in the movie is during the final fight between Harry and Peter. Peter shows up at Harry's house wearing the black symbiote costume and is mad about Goblin Jr. being the reason that MJ left Peter. However, this fight is about more than that, since Harry still blames Peter for killing his father, and Peter is done trying to convince him. After wailing on him a little bit, Peter kicks Harry into the path of a rogue glider, sending him flying into a shelf of good old-fashioned pumpkin bombs. After some mental torment, he knocks Harry out against the wall, at least so he thinks. But in fact, Harry is awake, and as Peter is walking away, Harry decides to chuck a pumpkin bomb at Pete, who dodges it thanks to his spider sense, but then thanks to the symbiote throws it back at Harry, causing it to explode basically right next to his face. If it weren't for the goblin serum, Harry would definitely be dead, and honestly, even with it, I'm surprised that he survived. But you do have to admit, it was pretty damn cold, but Harry also did kind of deserve it. And at 6, assorted killings. For being a hero that has a strict no killing rule, Spider-Man has killed quite a few people, but perhaps most notably Logan's friend Charlie, in the graphic novel Spider-Man vs. Wolverine from 1987. The plot of this is that both Wolverine and Spidey end up in Berlin for their own reasons, and as the title suggests, Wolverine and Spider-Man end up fighting each other, in a graveyard to be exact. The fight is actually a good one, with Spidey even having the mindset to kill Wolverine because Logan might kill him first. They don't know each other that well at this point. The fight ends only when a helicopter of bad guys shows up looking for Logan's friend Charlie. Wolverine wanted to help his friend stop killing, but now since this helicopter showed up, Wolverine wants to kill her quick, since, you know, they aren't going to. Which he doesn't actually have to do because Spider-Man does. After Charlie intentionally sets off his spider sense and gets a super-powered spider punch to the face, killing her instantly. Halfway through into number 5, kissed Gwen's daughter. After learning that your father isn't actually your father, but rather your mother's ex who she cheated on with his worst enemy, what do you think you would do? Also, you're aging more rapidly because your real father has some form of goblin serum in his system that somehow passed on to you, but you only age up physically, so you're mentally 10 with the body of an adult. Yeah, you may want to skip this number. Since Pete and Sarah end up getting closer after fighting off dealers in Paris, but this was made even worse when they're in Paris without MJ, who Peter didn't bring for whatever reason. The thing is though, Peter thinks that this is entirely platonic. This just goes to show you that if your partner thinks that someone's trying to get with you, you should listen. Because lo and behold, Sarah ends up planting one on her almost dad, just as MJ shows up for a surprise visit. And I think the name of the storyline, Sins Remembered, is way too fitting and is definitely going to be seared into my brain now. God damn it. You thought that Gwen and Green Goblin was bad? Oh boy. And at 4, sold his marriage. After siding with Tony in the events of the first Civil War, Spider-Man has to reveal his identity to the world in order to continue fighting crime. And you know, since now every supervillain on Earth knows how to get to Spider-Man, Kingpin ends up attacking Peter at his home. He dodges the bullets, but they end up hitting Aunt May instead, putting her in critical condition. This is the start of the One More Day storyline, probably the most universally hated Spider-Man run of all time. Since in order to save Aunt May, Peter talks to Mephisto and ends up selling his marriage to MJ in order to save his aunt. So their entire marriage will get erased so that he can have at least one more day with his aunt. Aside from living with the consequences of your actions, because you know, that's not what heroes do. Which is also pretty goddamn horrible. You wanna know what else is pretty goddamn horrible? Like, MJ had to agree to it as well, or at least she had to say that she did. But like, seriously, if you're being realistic, okay? How many years does Aunt May really have left? Okay, like, honestly, not many. So selling your marriage to bring back your one foot in the grave aunt just seems like a not so even trade to me. I'm just saying, MJ's gonna be around for longer. You heard it right, ladies. I'd let my old aunt die for you. Hit me up. Getting close to the end into number 3, One Moment in Time. The One Moment in Time story comes after the One More Day story, and this seems to be the storyline that No Way Home is taking inspiration from. However, after saving Aunt May, Wilson Fisk ends up sending a hitman after MJ's Aunt Anna Watson, but the hitman, revealed to be Eddie Brock, ends up attacking Mary Jane. Peter takes the wounded MJ to Doctor Strange, who heals her, but Peter also insists that Doctor Strange performs a spell that causes everyone to forget that he's Spider-Man, because again, not living with the consequences of his actions. Strange contacts Iron Man and Mr. Fantastic for advice, and they end up agreeing with him eventually. They do, however, decide that nobody should remember who Peter is aside from Peter. Not Doctor Strange, not Tony, not Mr. Fantastic, not MJ. But Peter, being Peter, jumps out of his protective bubble and grabs MJ and pulls her in before the spell's complete. They wake up in a motel and Peter explains what happened. Mary Jane asks why he couldn't just let her forget, and then she explains that she can't be with him because it's only a matter of time before somebody rips off his mask again and they go after her family, and that's a danger that she can't let happen. Back in the present though, Mary Jane also explains that he has to move on and find somebody who can be with him. Should've just let her forget it, man. Penultimately, in at number 2, hit Mary Jane. To get things straight, I understand that finding out that you're actually a clone and that the real Peter Parker has been living his life for the past few years as Ben Reilly because he thought he was the clone would be pretty earth-shattering, but nonetheless, it doesn't excuse this behavior. You may be under a lot of stress, but you never hit or take it out on your partner in any way whatsoever. No matter what gender you are or aren't, you just don't, okay? But Peter didn't get that memo for a minute, since in the Clone Wars storyline after finding this out, Peter and Ben are in the middle of a scrap. Mary Jane admittedly doesn't make the brightest move though when she attempts to break the two up, but Peter instinctively backhands her across the room, a moment we see referenced in Spider-Man 3 in the cafe that MJ works at. However, in the comic, Mary Jane was actually currently pregnant with his child, and while Peter does instantly regret this and is filled with shame and guilt, he runs away. He doesn't check on his pregnant wife. He flees and joins up with Jackal, so yeah. Not the finest moment there, dude. Finally, in at number 1, killed Mary Jane. I know I say I hate talking about this, but honestly, if I have to suffer through this knowledge, so does everyone else. It's like my own way of being a supervillain. In the Spider-Man Reigns storyline, it's revealed that Mary Jane is dead, but it's also revealed later on why she's dead, since she was married to Peter, and as I've mentioned, did eventually want to have kids with him. The thing is though, a radioactive spider bite in your hand does more to a man than lets him stick to walls and perform incredible acrobatics. It also fills that man with radiation, and anything else he feels also gets filled with radiation, if you catch my drift. Whether you're role-playing a lab experiment or not, that's what ended up happening after all, since Mary Jane ends up dying of cancer thanks to the radiation that Peter was packing in those swimmers. Yeah, it's absolutely horrible, and while yes, it's a question that everyone had, it's not something we ever wanted an answer to, especially if this is the way that it was gonna go. And a 10 an affair. Now, Betty Brant got married in Amazing Spider-Man number 156 and headed off to Paris for a honeymoon that doubled as a work assignment for her and her new husband, reporter Ned Leeds. However, in Amazing Spider-Man issue 183, we see Peter propose to Mary Jane and her turn him down, which puts him in a pretty dark place, which means that when Betty shows up in Peter's apartment in Amazing Spider-Man 184, there are going to be some issues. However, Betty claims to have left Ned on their honeymoon, while also on assignment together. But here's the biggest kicker. She never told Ned that she was leaving him, but she still intends on sparking a romantic relationship with Peter, which he ends up shutting her down in number 186, telling her that he can't be with her. But she doesn't take no for an answer, and in issue 187 makes her own move and just goes for the kiss, saying, "Shut up darling, just kiss me." The next panel then cuts to a few hours later, which sparked the debate whether he and Betty actually ended up bumping more than lips. And then Ned ends up threatening to kill Peter if he doesn't stay out of Betty's life. So, yeah. And at 9, failed Gwen. There are multiple instances of Spider-Man failing Gwen Stacy, both in the comics and in the movies. The more recent moment being in Amazing Spider-Man 2 starring Andrew Garfield. In both instances, Gwen Stacy is killed thanks to the Green Goblin, although in the comics it was debated for ages whether or not Peter was to blame, since he could have been the reason her neck snapped. It was also debated whether or not she was dead before the plummet, but I think we can all agree that she fell for him. She fell head over heels. And this idea that it was Peter's fault was only added onto in The Amazing Spider-Man, since the only reason Gwen was there was because Peter couldn't stay away from her, because he didn't give his blood to Harry, and then because he was relying more on his webs than his physical ability as Spider-Man. But at least the Tobey Maguire version didn't end up having any issues with Gwen Stacy, right? Oh wait. And at 8, kissed Gwen. While the comic version and the second movie version ended up getting their Gwens killed, Tobey's version ended up saving his when she fell out of a building in Spider-Man 3. Doing this even earned him the key to the city. And while a lot of the bad things that Peter does in this movie can be written off as the symbiote, at this point, Peter hasn't gotten it yet. So, when at the ceremony, when he was going to get to the key to the city, he decided to go the extra mile and let Gwen kiss him while he was hanging upside down. That's entirely on him. Something that Mary Jane, his current girlfriend, who was also at the ceremony and knew his identity, didn't enjoy. Especially because firstly, that was like their kiss theme, because like it was the kiss that they had after he saved her in the first movie. And secondly, because she left J. Jonah Jameson's son at the altar for Peter, and then this man goes and kisses another girl right in front of her doing their thing. Yeah, that's a total move. That a horrible idea. As an empath, I know how MJ was feeling in that instance, but I really don't get why he thought that this was a good idea. Like, yeah, sure, the papers will love it, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. You aren't even getting pictures of this to sell to JJ, so like, what's the point of pissing off your girl? Horrible move overall. And at 7, almost killed Shocker. The 90s animated series for Spider-Man has a lot going for it. I love the series and I've watched it many times. In fact, I'm watching it right now again. But the things this Peter did while using the symbiote suit are kind of messed up. For instance, JJJ ends up putting up a bounty on him for accusations of thievery. But when people start using sonic weapons, he ends up trying to blow them up. There is literally a line where he says, "My suit has cruise control, but your suits have backpacks that blow up when they get wet." Yeah, well, he then breaks a fire hydrant to shower them with water, which basically would have killed them if they didn't run away. He also almost killed Shocker during their battle at the church, just before Brock becomes Venom and Peter loses the symbiote. He saves him just in the nick of time, but it's certainly not a good look for a show that will really only say destroy and not kill. Like, the Punisher comes in and they say lethal force, and then that's it. And then like one episode, Spider-Man says that the Spot doesn't look like a killer, but that's the only time they have anything close to the word kill. I mean, like, I get it, like it was the 90s and they didn't really go that dark, but still. And at 6, the Fairy. While attempting to stop a weapons deal, Spider-Man gets into a fight with a vulture that nearly destroys a ferry full of people in Spider-Man Homecoming. And while it was totally meant to be like the most innocent thing, it certainly wasn't a smart idea. Honestly, Spider-Man should have just thrown the weapon into the ocean as a way to stop it instead of webbing it onto the boat. But technically, I guess he didn't know what it could do, but it was also still firing on its own when no one was holding it, which should have been enough warning that this wouldn't end well. However, he webs an energy weapon to the ground and then it splits the ferry in half. He does his best to save it, but only ends up being 98% successful. Like, it was working until some dude gets a little too excited and starts clapping and breaking the webbing, which wouldn't really be Peter's fault. But then when the webs start to break, Pete just kind of like sits there and watches and doesn't really try to repair anything. He eventually jumps in to try to grab one web, but like plenty had broken before this, so he should have kept going. As soon as she said 98% successful, you go out and you do it again. Like, come on, bro. Halfway through into number 5, tried to kill Sandman. This is something from Spider-Man 3 that we could consider to be because of the symbiote. However, considering how Peter wanted to kill the guy he thought killed his uncle when he first got his powers, I don't think the symbiote has much to do with this instance of him wanting his uncle's killer dead either. Sure, he's a little more aggressive about it. Like, without the suit, he probably would have asked a couple questions first, but I think that ultimately the fact that he wanted his uncle's killer dead was the driving force behind this. I mean, like, the suit definitely made him like really go for it, but he wanted it. Obviously, he doesn't end up actually killing Marco, but he certainly thought he did. He was proud of it too, even telling Aunt May, who he won't even tell that he's Spider-Man to, despite not living at home anymore and her being attacked by enemies multiple times, and then getting mad at him when he runs off because he has some Spider-Manning to do. He really only snaps out of it when Aunt May tells him that what Spider-Man did was pretty messed up. But like, I feel like she kinda like knew. Like, she was like, yeah, that's up, man. Spider-Man shouldn't have done that. Do you think that this version of Aunt May knew that he was Spider-Man, or do you think that she was oblivious? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. In at 4, Broken Promise. Okay, spoiler alert for No Way Home, since I feel like I still need to give a warning about it, even though the movie was released last year. So for this and number 2, there's a Spider-Man No Way Home warning in effect. Okay, if you haven't seen it, go do that, because it's an amazing movie. But the ending had me wailing. So as we know in the climax of the movie, spoiler alert, at the Statue of Liberty, we see the multiverse crack open and everyone who ever knew that Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker is now coming through. So in an effort to stop this from happening, Peter tells Doctor Strange to cast a new spell, this time that makes everyone forget about Peter Parker, including Doctor Strange, his best friend, and his girlfriend. In this case being Ned and MJ, not Doctor Strange's best friend and girlfriend. Peter goes to say goodbye and tells his friends that he will find them and remind them of everything they've been through. MJ says that she loves him and then tells him to say it when he finds her after the spell. The spell is cast, and then Peter just doesn't remind MJ and Ned because he thinks that they're safer without him. While this ending is perfect and sets up a new trilogy where the main complaint of him being Iron Boy Jr. is gone, it still breaks my heart. It's like this is like the same thing that happens at the end of my favorite book. So yeah, the Broken Promise thing, on my list for sure. Getting close to the end, and in number 3, Threatened Kingpin. Spider-Man was in a weird place during the Civil War arc at Marvel Comics. After revealing his identity to the public, he was at odds with Tony Stark over the Superhuman Registration Act, which made Peter a wanted man. On the run, Peter, Aunt May, and MJ ended up hiding in a rundown motel while he was a fugitive. However, the Kingpin ended up hiring a hitman to put a hit on Spider-Man. It resulted in Aunt May accidentally being shot instead, leaving her critically injured. Peter would give her a blood transfusion, and while she was in a coma, he went after Wilson Fisk. Peter confronted the mob boss in a prison and gave him a fate worse than death. He defeated him in front of everyone. Peter beat the absolute living snot out of Kingpin, like absolutely to a pulp, but refused to kill him at the moment because he realized that a supervillain living with everyone knowing he can be beaten, especially Kingpin, was better than ending his life. But also mentioned that if Aunt May did die from this, he would come back and fill his lungs with webbing and watch him suffocate, which is incredibly dark, but also kind of makes sense. I'm surprised he didn't say something like, "I will pull your face off your body by just not stopping the sticking of my hand to your bald head." But hey, I guess that's just my thinking. That's what I would do. Penultimately, in at number 2, Bitter. Again, another spoiler warning for Spider-Man No Way Home. However, this time around, it isn't about the MCU Peter Parker, rather Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Thanks to the multiverse and the return of the Amazing Spider-Man actor, we got to see how Andrew's Spider-Man went on after the death of Gwen Stacy. And while the writers wanted to focus on Tom's Spider-Man rather than the other two and not let them steal the show, which the actors agreed to, we still got some more story about where Andrew and Tobey went after their series completed. One such reveal was that Andrew's Peter stopped pulling his punches and got bitter, heavily implying that his Spider-Man ended up killing someone, be it intentional or not, which some have also linked to the Morbius trailer, since there is graffiti in one of the scenes with the word murderer spray painted over Sam Raimi's Spider-Man suit. However, that pose is also from a loading screen in Spider-Man PS4, so it's safe to assume that it's just a placeholder for the actual movie, potentially to prevent any spoiler about what happened to the Spideys after their movies concluded. Do you want to see an Amazing Spider-Man 3 where like he fights Venom or something? I don't know, let me know down below, I kinda do. And finally, in at number 1, Spider Carnage. Spider Carnage isn't just the Spider-Man villain, he's actually an alternate version of Spider-Man. Hailing from one of the many Earths, this character was introduced in the 90s Spider-Man animated series. Again, my favorite Spider-Man animated series. This Peter's life was actually very similar to the main Spider-Man, except his version also lost Aunt May and developed a resentment for humanity. And then he had to deal with a clone, which definitely sucked. Until he and the clone learned that they didn't know who was actually the clone. Cause like, you know, the one going by Ben Reilly could have actually been the real Peter Parker. And this broke this version of Peter, who was actually still Peter. A Carnage symbiote from another universe actually ended up sensing this hatred and resentment for humanity, and through a portal created by Jonathan Ohm, it bonded with Peter, driving him even more insane, and then starting to call himself Spider Carnage. From my understanding, this character hasn't been seen since that final episode, but I still want him to like come back in some aspect because this is so messed up but so good. Please, like add this character to the MCU or let Andrew Garfield fight a version of the Carnage symbiote and then create Spider Carnage or fight off Spider Carnage or something, please. He wanted to fight an alien, so can we please do that? Please. Also, where's the pop figure? They came out with 90s Spider-Man pop figures, but not Spider Carnage? What the hell?
Almost let a little girl die in surgery. In Amazing Spider-Man number 700, Doc Ock switches minds with Spider-Man, sort of. Doc Ock, now in Spider-Man's body, is exposed to all of Peter's memories and experiences, and it definitely has an effect. He decides to become a superhero, calling himself the Superior Spider-Man. However, in the first issue of Superior Spider-Man, it's revealed that a portion of Peter is still residing inside of the body, and it has some control over Doc Ock's actions. So later in Superior Spider-Man number 8, the Superior Spidey finds a device that he can use to get rid of the last bits of Peter Parker that remain in his brain. However, in order to gain access to this device, he first has to perform surgery on a little girl. So this leads to a scene where Ghost Spider-Man is like in the background, basically trying to prevent Doc Ock from doing the surgery, knowing that Doc is going to finish off Peter Parker after he's successful. However, Peter does eventually relent and Doc succeeds in his surgery, but for a moment there it kind of seemed like Pete was ready to let a little girl die so that he could live. Not exactly Spidey's finest hour.
Number 9, killed MJ. So Peter's track record when it comes to loved ones isn't as bad as someone like Daredevil, but hey, it isn't great either. In alternate universes especially, Spider-Man has caused a lot of harm to those that he's loved, and I mean a lot. and even in the main continuity, his track record isn't so great. In the Marvel Zombies universe, Spider-Man was transformed into a zombie, and as this happened, felt the uncontrollable urge taking over him. He was like, I'm so hungry, I gotta eat people. He tried to tell his loved ones to get away from him, but it was too late, and he ended up not only killing, but full on eating both Mary Jane and his Aunt May. Of course, can we really blame Peter for this one? Not so much. He was a zombie and he wasn't really in control here. But knowing Peter, you can bet he likely reminisced and blamed himself continuously for this for days on end, even while he was a zombie. Because, you know, Peter just loves to blame himself for everything. And before we move on to this next spot, just a quick little reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying it. It really helps us out at the channel. And thank you if you've already done it.
Number 8. Allowed a kidnapping. In Amazing Spider-Man number 112, we see Spider-Man really worried about Aunt May. She's gone missing after Gwen Stacy gave her a hard time for meddling in Peter's life too much, and he spent most of the previous issue searching for Aunt May. In this issue, we see Spidey has become so distracted, he doesn't even notice this guy getting kidnapped nearby. What's worse, when Pete does notice this guy, who also notices him, he starts the classic Spidey monologue about how helping this poor slob will take hours. Hours he could spend searching for Aunt May. He actually leaves the guy to get kidnapped, saying, maybe someday I'll have the courage to face myself again. Damn, Pete, you could have easily stopped and saved this guy. If that wasn't bad enough, later on it turns out that Aunt May wasn't even missing, she just had a new job. Way to go, Spidey.
Number 7, worst boyfriend ever. I wish I could say this was a one-time instance, but this is one of the worst, most consistent things that we've seen from Peter Parker throughout all of his relationships. He's not only super awkward around the ladies, but also has a tendency to behave badly with his romantic partners as well. For one, Peter very rarely lets people in on his secret of being Spider-Man, which causes a lot of problems early on in relationships that usually end up causing a breakup before things get super serious. And you might be thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, Amanda, hasn't Peter Parker told Mary Jane before that he's Spider-Man? Yes, but she also apparently knew from like day one that he was Spider-Man, so I don't know if that even counts because she knew the whole time. But beyond that, he also says things and does kind of things that are just in general awful. He snapped at his partners, lied to them, gotten them into all kinds of danger, blamed them for things that weren't their fault, and even at times physically hit them. Like when Mary Jane tried to break up a fight between Peter Parker and his clone Ben Reilly, and in a mindless rage, he slammed her back, causing her to go flying into a wall. Also, Spider-Man is super strong, so even if he like flicked Mary Jane, I imagine that would be terribly painful. Oh, and she was also pregnant at the time with their child, which just makes it even worse.
Number 6. He almost robbed a jewelry store. Okay, I know this isn't supposed to be top 10 things Spider-Man almost did, but I have to mention another really weird out of character Spider-Man moment. In Amazing Spider-Man number 87, Spidey has been suffering from an illness that he determines to be the radioactivity in his blood slowly killing him. He's been feeling delirious for a while and having a hard time using his powers properly, and he's swinging around the city, monologuing, wondering what it means for his future. Suddenly, he remembers it's Gwen Stacy's birthday, classic Peter, and he doesn't have a gift. So in a bizarre moment, we see Spider-Man randomly decide to break into a jewelry store and he steals a necklace for her. He realizes what he's doing before it's too late and he kind of like puts it back, but he's already caused property damage and like, you know, thank God they don't have cameras because Jameson would just have a field day with that. The whole thing is just a really weird moment. Spider-Man starting to wonder if he's losing his mind. The whole thing was really surprising to me and he almost went through with it.
Number 5, killed MJ again. Yeah, for someone who claims to love her so much, Peter is not very good at treating MJ well. This one comes to us from another alternate reality though, so we do have to, you know, asterisk and add that in there, little editor note. Because of course, Peter would never kill Mary Jane in the main continuity, or more, he just hasn't done so yet. In the reality of Spider-Man Reign, we're taken to a potential future reality where Peter killed Mary Jane simply by loving her. Their being intimate, at least that's what's implied, caused Mary Jane to be exposed to Peter's radioactivity at a level where she ended up getting cancer and dying. His radioactive fluids. Yeah, that's pretty intense. In typical Peter fashion, this becomes one of his greatest regrets, giving MJ cancer, and only serves to basically drive him insane and turn him senile, which really doesn't help anyone and makes for a pretty crazy story when he returns as a bizarre and depressed version of Old Man Spider-Man. Old Man Spider-Man is super depressing.
Number 4. Worked for the Jackal. The whole clone saga was definitely one of Spidey's lowest points, especially just the way that they totally messed with Peter's character throughout the whole thing. He was calling himself the Spider and just acting generally unpleasant, but when he found out that he wasn't the real Peter Parker but a clone, he really didn't receive that news very well. The Jackal somehow ends up convincing Pete to work with him, and somehow Peter buys it, even though it means working against his friend Ben Reilly. Peter eventually does come to his senses, but man, how could he have ever been convinced to work with a supervillain in the first place? You know, every time I look back on this era, I remember why people hate it so much. Both versions of Spider-Man are pretty decent, but the way that they're pitted against one another as if there can only be one and everything, the whole thing just felt kind of forced.
Number 3 was too apathetic. Spider-Man's apathy is something that haunts him to this day and makes him pretty much the one to blame for his Uncle Ben's death. Well, I mean, I personally think Peter is much too hard on himself here, and that being that harsh only leads to more disasters later down the road that his intense sense of responsibility has a hand in causing, but I digress. Peter for sure thinks this is the worst thing he has ever done, allowing the man who would go on to kill his uncle to get past him. At the time when the guard who pursued the criminal asked for help, Peter simply didn't see the point in aiding. That wasn't his job, he thought. He wasn't a hero. However, afterward he learned that with great power comes great responsibility, a lesson that has haunted him and continues to both haunt and inspire him to this day.
Number 2. He killed Charlemagne. In the one-shot Spider-Man vs. Wolverine from 1987, we get to witness an epic showdown between these two fan favorites. Peter winds up in Germany investigating a mysterious arms dealer. Charlemagne turns out to be an old associate of Wolverine's, and she's got all kinds of people after her. They track her to East Berlin, where Wolverine plans to kill her, sparing her from being tortured by the KGB. Spider-Man isn't really cool with the whole killing her part of the plan, so the two of them have a bit of a fight about it. However, after a helicopter breaks up the fight for a second, Peter's Spidey sense kicks in, and thinking that Wolverine is behind him, he turns around and delivers a full-powered punch, instantly killing Charlemagne. It's implied that she probably intended for this to happen as she was wanting to die and stuff, but still, if you had told me that Spider-Man once punched a woman with no superpowers and killed her in one hit, I'd be a little skeptical. But it really happened.
Number 1, probably killed Gwen Stacy. Once again, Peter is causing harm to those he loves. What's more, this whole moment where he attempted to save Gwen and we hear her neck snap is made even worse for Peter in terms of his own guilt over the situation by the fact that he never really knows if it was him or if it was Green Goblin who is to blame for her death. Was she dead before he grabbed her, or did she die when his webbing latched on to save her, breaking her neck? We still don't really know for sure, although I think Green Goblin claims that she died while she was falling. He's like, a fall like that, she'd die before she hits the ground. And I'm like, wait, is that how falling works? It's not. Anyways. I mean, either way, Peter Parker is kind of to blame here, as Green Goblin has a tendency to target those that Spider-Man loves. So once again, just loving Gwen was in a way a terrible thing for him to do to her.